When people think of South Korea today, they picture high-speed internet, global pop culture, and a thriving democracy. What many don't realise is that not long ago, the country experienced something very different. Military takeovers, suspended constitutions, and governments born not from ballots, but from force. For younger generations, the word coup sounds distant, almost fictional, but for millions of Koreans, it was reality, and the political system they live under today was shaped by it more than they realize. South Korea's coup era didn't begin because democracy failed. It began because democracy hadn't yet been fully built. In the years following war and national division, the country was poor, unstable, and deeply anxious about survival. Political institutions were weak, the economy was fragile, and fear of chaos, of collapse, of external threats dominated public life. In that environment, military leaders presented themselves not as power-hungry rulers, but as saviors. They claimed that civilian politicians were corrupt, incompetent, or incapable of managing national crises. Their justification was simple: stability first, democracy later. Supporters of the coup-era government still repeat this argument today. They say military rule brought rapid economic development. They argue that without authoritarian control, South Korea would never have industrialized fast enough to survive in a hostile region. According to this view, democracy was a luxury the country couldn't afford at the time, and there is a reason this argument still resonates. Under military governments, South Korea did modernize rapidly. Infrastructure expanded, industries grew, living standards improved. To many citizens struggling with poverty, order felt preferable to uncertainty. For them, the coup governments weren't tyrants, they were builders. But this narrative hides a darker reality. Behind the economic growth was repression. Political opposition was crushed, media was censored, students, labor activists, and journalists were surveilled, arrested, or worse. Elections existed, but their outcomes were often predetermined. The state didn't simply govern, it monitored loyalty. Those who opposed the regime were branded as threats to national security. Emergency powers were used to suspend civil rights. Martial law became a political tool, not a temporary measure. Critics argued that this is the true legacy of the coup era, a system where authority justified itself through fear. Fear of instability, fear of enemies, fear of internal collapse. When democracy finally arrived through mass protests and constitutional reform, it did not erase this legacy overnight. Institutions built under authoritarian rule didn't disappear. They adapted. This turning point is often traced to the 1987 democratization movement, when nationwide protests forced constitutional reform and the introduction of direct presidential elections. For many Koreans, this moment symbolized the idea that democracy was not granted by the state, but demanded by citizens, a belief that continues to influence political activism today. The prosecution service, intelligence agencies, and national police retained enormous power. Emergency laws remained on the books. Strong executive authority became normalized. This is why some Koreans argue that today's democracy still carries authoritarian DNA. Critics frequently point to national security legislation that originated during authoritarian rule as evidence of institutional continuity. They argue that security-based framing, labeling dissent as dangerous or disloyal, remains a powerful political tool. Supporters of these laws, however, insist they are necessary in a divided peninsula, highlighting the unresolved conflict and persistent external threats. They point to how easily governments invoke national security. They point to how often dissent is framed as dangerous or irresponsible. They point to how quickly political conflicts escalate into accusations of treason or sabotage. Others strongly reject this view. They argue that South Korea's democratic transition was real and meaningful. They emphasize direct elections, independent courts, and an active civil society. According to them, comparing modern Korea to its coup era is not only inaccurate, it's insulting to decades of democratic struggle. They argue that strong institutions exist not to suppress citizens, but to prevent instability from returning. This disagreement defines modern Korean political debate. One side sees echoes of authoritarian control in every exercise of state power. The other sees necessary governance in a volatile geopolitical environment. Younger generations are caught in the middle. Many grew up with freedoms their parents never had. They've never experienced censorship, midnight arrests, or military patrols on city streets. To them, stories of coups and martial law feel abstract, almost exaggerated. But older generations remember differently. For them, democracy wasn't granted, it was fought for. Every protest carried risk, every political decision felt personal. This generational gap shapes how people interpret political authority today. When the government expands its powers, some see protection, others see a warning. South Korea is a democracy today, but it is a democracy shaped by survival, speed, and scars. And until those scars are fully acknowledged, the shadow of the coup era will continue to influence how Koreans argue about power, freedom, and the future of their political system.